Imagine, for a moment, that you are him. You are no longer the emperor, the master of Europe, the man whose shadow fell across a continent. All of that is a distant, dreamlike memory. Now, you are a prisoner. You are trapped on a tiny, remote volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic. A windswept speck of land, 1,200 miles from the nearest coastline. The air you breathe is damp and salty. The relentless trade wind a constant, wearing noise against the walls of your modest, rat-infested house. Every day, you wake up to the same view of a barren, alien landscape. Every day, you are watched by the same impassive British soldiers. And every day, a dull, gnawing pain in your stomach grows a little stronger, a slow, internal decay that mirrors the profound, soul-crushing boredom of your external world. This is not a battle to be won with a brilliant cavalry charge or a daring flanking maneuver. This is the slowest death in history. The story of Napoleon Bonaparte is a story of almost superhuman speed and epic scale. It is a whirlwind of cannon fire, of glorious victories at Austerlitz and Marengo, of sweeping political reforms like the Napoleonic Code that would reshape the legal systems of the world. It is a story of imperial grandeur, of lavish coronations, of a man who redrew the map of Europe according to his own colossal ambition. His life was a blur of motion, of frantic campaigns, of lightning-fast marches that repeatedly stunned his enemies. He was a man who lived in a constant state of becoming, a force of nature who never stood still. But the story we are exploring tonight is not about that man. Our story begins where his ends. This is a journey into the profound and terrible stillness that consumed his final 6 years. It is a deep, methodical dive into the boring brilliance of his exile on the island of Saint Helena. We will not be recounting his great battles or his political triumphs. Instead, we will explore the slow, grinding, and deeply tedious reality of his imprisonment. We will walk through his monotonous daily routines, examining the repetitive meals, the limited conversations, and the slow, endless work of dictating his memoirs. We will conduct a clinical examination of his tedious medical symptoms, tracing the slow, inexorable decline of his health as documented in the contradictory logs of his doctors. We will explore the monotonous geography of his island prison and the mundane, oppressive protocols of his British captors. Because to truly understand Napoleon's final days, you must understand that the battle he was fighting was not against an army, but against a far more insidious enemy: hopelessness. You wouldn't have survived his exile, not because of a stray bullet or a sword thrust, but because of the slow, grinding attrition of the human spirit. This is a story about the death of a giant, an end that came not with a bang, but with a long, drawn-out, and deeply human whisper. The voyage to nowhere, a 70-day journey into oblivion. Your final, agonizing death begins not on the island, but on the sea. After your ultimate defeat at Waterloo and your surrender to the British, you are transferred to a formidable 74-gun Royal Navy ship of the line, the HMS Northumberland. As the ship weighs anchor and the last hazy coastline of Europe dissolves into the horizon behind you, a profound and terrible sense of finality would begin to set in. This is not a temporary exile to a nearby island like Elba, from which a dramatic escape is possible. This is a one-way voyage into oblivion. You are the most famous and most feared man in the world, and the British Empire is now taking you to the most remote and inaccessible corner of their globe, a place from which there can be no return. The journey itself is an ordeal of profound and soul-crushing monotony, a slow, 70-day funeral procession across the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic. The ship is your first prison, a cramped, creaking, wooden world governed by the strict, unfamiliar routines of the British Navy. You are accompanied by a small, loyal retinue of followers who have chosen to share your exile, but you are all captives, Every moment of your day is observed by the watchful, impassive eyes of your jailer, the stern Admiral Sir George Cockburn, and the Royal Marines who stand guard at your cabin door. You are no longer Your Majesty the Emperor. You are General Bonaparte, a prisoner of war. Your days fall into a rigid, repetitive, and deeply boring schedule. You would wake, have your breakfast, and then spend the morning in the main cabin, dictating the story of your life, the glorious memoirs of your great campaigns, to your secretaries. This is your last battle, a war fought with memory and words against the impending erasure of your legacy. After the midday meal, you might be permitted to walk the quarterdeck for an hour, a slow, prescribed pacing back and forth, always under the gaze of the British officers. In the evenings you would play cards or chess with your companions, a sad, hollow echo of the vibrant intellectual life of your imperial court. For a man who had lived a life of constant whirlwind motion, who had moved armies across continents with lightning speed, this slow, powerless, and predictable existence would have been a unique and exquisite form of torture. You, who had once pored over maps to redraw the borders of Europe, now look at maps to chart the agonizingly slow progress of your own floating prison towards its final, desolate destination. The 70 days at sea were not just a journey. They were a deliberate, psychological process of dismantling your identity, a slow, methodical, stripping away of your power and your hope, a long, boring, and deeply humbling prelude to the final, tedious chapter of your life, the volcanic prison, a monotonous tour of Saint Helena. After 70 days of staring at the empty horizon of the Atlantic, a shape finally appears in the distance. But it is not a sight that brings hope. It is a jagged, dark mass, rising abruptly from the vast, empty ocean. This is your final destination. This is Saint Helena. To survive here, you must first survive the profound, crushing hopelessness of the place itself, a prison designed not by man, but by God or by geology. It is an island that is, for all intents and purposes, the end of the world. Located in the middle of the South Atlantic, it is one of the most isolated, inhabited places on Earth. It is a mere speck of volcanic rock, 10 miles long and 6 miles wide. The nearest landmass is Africa, 1,200 miles to the east. South America lies nearly 2,000 miles to the west. There is nothing in any direction but the endless, unforgiving sea. The island itself is the ancient, eroded peak of a massive underwater volcano. It has no gentle, sandy beaches to welcome a visitor. Instead, it rises from the ocean in a series of sheer, black, volcanic cliffs, hundreds of feet high, a natural and impenetrable fortress wall, constantly battered by the heavy ocean swell. Your first and only point of entry is the small, ramshackle port town of Jamestown, a collection of buildings wedged into a narrow, arid ravine on the island's northern coast. From here, the only way into the interior is up a steep and winding road, a journey into a strange and often bleak landscape. The island is a place of stark contrasts. The coastal regions are barren and volcanic, almost lunar in their desolation. As you climb higher, the landscape changes to a greener, more fertile plateau in the center of the island. But this is no tropical paradise. It is a place of rolling hills, often shrouded in a damp, clinging mist, and buffeted by the relentless, monotonous drone of the southeasterly trade winds, a wind that blows almost every single day of the year. This was the genius and the cruelty of the British choice of Saint Helena as your prison. Its geography was its own greatest security feature. Escape was not just unlikely, it was a physical and logistical impossibility. There was simply nowhere to go. The British reinforced this natural security with a formidable military presence, stationing a garrison of over 2,000 soldiers on the tiny island, and maintaining a Royal Navy squadron of fast frigates that constantly patrolled its waters, day and night. Any ship approaching the island would be spotted days before it could reach the coast. The island was not just a place of exile. It was a carefully chosen, high-security, open-air prison, and the monotony of its landscape, the endless wind, and the oppressive, inescapable dampness of its climate were all part of the sentence. Longwood House, the damp, rat-infested reality of your final home. After arriving on the desolate shores of Saint Helena, you are not even granted the small comfort of a respectable residence. For your final home, the British have not chosen the governor's pleasant and well-appointed mansion in the valley. Instead, you are taken to a place on the highest, most exposed, and most inhospitable part of the island's plateau. It is a place called Longwood, a former summer residence for the lieutenant governor that had fallen into a state of significant disrepair. This is to be your final palace, a single-story, sprawling wooden structure, hastily and shoddily converted to house you and your small band of loyal followers. It is a house that is, from the very beginning, an instrument of your suffering. The first and most constant enemy at Longwood is the damp. Located on the part of the island that is almost perpetually shrouded in a cold, clinging mist and battered by the relentless trade winds, the house is a sponge. The air inside is never truly dry. A thick, clammy humidity permeates everything. The wallpaper, a cheap and garish green print, peels from the walls in long, curling strips. A fine layer of mildew covers the books on your shelves and the leather of your boots. Your fine clothes, the last vestiges of your imperial wardrobe, feel permanently damp to the touch, and the bed linens are cold and clammy when you climb into them at night. This oppressive dampness was not just a source of discomfort. In the medical understanding of the 19th century, it was considered a direct cause of ill health, a source of the rheumatic pains and chills that would begin to plague your existence. Your second constant companion is the rats. The old house and its outbuildings are infested with them. They are not shy, frightened creatures that live in the walls. They are a bold, thriving army that shares your home. You and your companions would be forced to endure the constant sound of their scratching and scurrying in the ceilings and beneath the floorboards. At night, they would grow even bolder, skittering across the floors of the billiard room, where you would spread your campaign maps, and even, to your profound and ultimate humiliation, sometimes running across the dining table during your evening meal. This was the final indignity for a man who had once dined in the grandest palaces of Europe, to have his meager meal interrupted by the rats who were now his fellow tenants. The house itself is a collection of small, dark, and poorly ventilated rooms, the air thick with the smell of mildew, and the constant smoke from the fireplaces that were kept burning in a futile attempt to combat the damp. This is your final world. A small bedroom, a study filled with the books and maps that were a sad echo of your former life of grand strategy, and a drawing room where you would endure the long, monotonous evenings. Longwood House was not a home. It was a carefully chosen tool of your exile, a prison designed not with iron bars, but with environmental and psychological oppression. Its physical decay was a constant, daily mirror for your own slow, inexorable decline. The jailer's gaze, the tedium of constant surveillance, the damp, the rats, and the oppressive gloom of Longwood House were your physical prison, but you were also subjected to a far more insidious and psychologically wearing form of confinement, the constant, unending, and deeply tedious surveillance of your British captors. This was a system of observation orchestrated by one man, the new governor of Saint Helena, Sir Hudson Lowe. He was not a grand villain in the traditional sense, but something far more draining, a humorless, rigid, and deeply paranoid bureaucrat, a man utterly terrified of the immense, career-defining responsibility that had been placed upon him. His single, obsessive mission was to ensure that you, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had escaped from Elba, would never, ever leave this rock. And to do this, he constructed a multi-layered prison of the human gaze. The first layer of this prison was immediate and intimate. A British officer, known as the orderly officer, was permanently stationed at Longwood House itself. His primary, non-negotiable duty was to obtain a visual confirmation of your presence at least twice a day. This led to a constant, petty, and deeply humiliating cat-and-mouse game. You, in an effort to retain some small measure of your imperial dignity and privacy, would often refuse to see him, shutting yourself in your room, or closing the shutters of your windows. The orderly officer would then be forced to peer through keyholes, climb on furniture to look through a high window, or listen for the sound of your voice from outside, all to satisfy his governor's demand for proof that you had not, somehow, vanished into thin air. The second layer was a physical perimeter. The grounds of Longwood were surrounded by a ring of sentry posts, manned by soldiers from the British Army garrison. During the day, this perimeter was loose, allowing you a limited and prescribed area in which to walk or ride your horse. But every day at sunset, the cage would tighten. The number of sentries would be doubled. They would move in closer to the house, forming a tight cordon. No one could enter or leave the grounds without a written pass signed by the governor himself. The setting of the sun was a daily, ritualistic reminder of your imprisonment. The third layer was an island-wide network of observation. The high volcanic peaks of Saint Helena were dotted with a series of signal stations. From these high vantage points, sentries with powerful telescopes watched the area around Longwood House constantly. If you ever chose to go for a ride within your designated limits, your every movement was tracked. The moment you left the house, a signal would be sent via a system of flags and semaphores, flashing from peak to peak across the island, instantly alerting Governor Lowe in his residence miles away. You were a man living in a fishbowl. Your every public action observed, reported, and recorded in a tedious daily log. This constant, suffocating surveillance, this war of petty restrictions and bureaucratic paranoia, was designed to do more than just prevent your escape. It was a form of psychological warfare, a slow, grinding process designed to break your spirit and remind you, every single minute of every single day, that you were no longer an emperor, but a prisoner under the unwavering, tedious, and inescapable jailer's gaze. The unchanging sun, a breakdown of the boring daily routine, faced with the crushing monotony of your island prison and the constant humiliating surveillance of your jailers, your only remaining weapon, your last sphere of influence, is time itself. If the British sought to control your every movement in the physical world, you would respond by creating a world of your own, governed by a rigid, formal, and deeply monotonous routine. You would fight the tedium of your imprisonment by imposing an even more structured tedium of your own making. This was not just a way to pass the endless, identical days. It was an act of quiet, stubborn defiance, a daily ritual designed to prove to yourself and to your captors that you were still an emperor and this was still your court. Your day would begin late, often not until mid-morning. You would rise and begin the elaborate, hours-long process of your morning toilette, the levee. This was a direct and deliberate echo of the formal court rituals you had established at the Tuileries Palace. Assisted by your loyal valets, you would wash, shave, and dress with meticulous care. The slow, formal process, a way of recreating a semblance of your former imperial dignity. You would spend a great deal of time in a hot bath, a habit that became more frequent as the years went on. The warmth, a small comfort against the damp chill of the house and the growing pains in your body. The main work of your day, the central pillar around which your entire existence now revolved, was the dictation of your memoirs. You would spend hours in your study, surrounded by the books and maps that were your last connection to a life of action. Pacing back and forth, you would dictate the story of your great campaigns of Italy, of Egypt, of Austerlitz, to your small group of loyal companions, men like the Count de Las Cases or General Montholon. This was your last battle, a war fought with memory and words against the British propaganda and the encroaching oblivion of history. It was a slow, methodical, and deeply repetitive process, going over the same battles and decisions again and again, refining the narrative, ensuring that your version of history would be the one that endured. The afternoons were long and empty. Sometimes you would take a short, prescribed carriage ride, a slow, looping journey within the small perimeter allotted to you by your guards. Other times, you would attempt to find distraction in creating a small garden, another tiny sphere of the world that you could attempt to shape and control. But as your health declined, you would spend more and more time indoors, locked in the gloomy, damp rooms of Longwood. The evening was another ritual of defiance. You would insist that your companions dress formally for dinner, as if they were attending a state function and not a grim, repetitive meal in a rat-infested farmhouse at the end of the world. The dinner itself was often a tense and silent affair. Afterwards, to pass the long, empty hours, you might read aloud from a French play by Corneille or Racine, or you would play a quiet, intense game of chess. This was your life, reduced from the conquest of a continent to the capture of a king. The routine was your armor against the despair of your situation, but it was also the very architecture of your cage. A limited palate, the monotony of the imperial menu. For a man who had once commanded the finest chefs in Europe, a man whose imperial banquets were legendary for their opulence and sophistication, the daily reality of food on Saint Helena was yet another form of slow, grinding humiliation. Every single item you consumed, from a loaf of bread to a bottle of wine, was provided by your British captors, meticulously logged and accounted for by the administration of the ever-suspicious Sir Hudson Lowe. The control of your menu was another chain, another cage, and the food itself was a constant, dispiriting reminder of your profound and total isolation from the world of refined tastes you had once commanded. The island of Saint Helena was not a bountiful paradise. It was a remote rock in the ocean, and the vast majority of its supplies had to be imported on the same long, slow sea voyage that had brought you there. The result was a diet of profound and soul-crushing monotony. The provisions supplied to your household were often of a poor quality, the kind of basic, uninspired fare intended for a military garrison. The beef and mutton were often tough and stringy, from old animals. The bread was coarse. The vegetables were limited, and fresh fruit was a rare luxury. It was the bland, boiled and roasted diet of the English, a cuisine that you and your French retinue found almost unbearably rustic and unrefined. This presented a daily, heroic challenge for your French chef, who had to wage a constant, quiet war in the kitchens of Longwood. His battle was to take these poor quality, repetitive and limited English ingredients and, through the sheer force of his culinary skill, to attempt to transform them into a semblance of the sophisticated French cuisine you were accustomed to. It was a daily struggle to create a sauce rich enough to disguise the toughness of the meat, to find a way to make the limited selection of root vegetables seem interesting, to bake a pastry that could rise in the damp and unpredictable climate. Every meal was an act of defiant artistry against the culinary mediocrity of your imprisonment. Your one remaining pleasure, the only part of the menu that offered any real comfort, was the wine. The British, knowing of your great appreciation for it, supplied your household with vast quantities. But even here, there was a battle. Much of the wine was mediocre, and you would often complain about the quality of the claret you were sent. Your true solace was found in a specific, sweet dessert wine from the Cape of Good Hope, Vin de Constance. It became your favorite, one of the few genuine luxuries and sensory pleasures left to you in a world of dampness and decay. But even this was tainted by your imprisonment. Every bottle was logged by your captors, every sip, a reminder of your complete dependence on the nation that had defeated you. The daily meal at Longwood was not a source of comfort. It was another battlefield, a slow, grinding war of attrition fought not for territory, but for a single, fleeting taste of a life you had lost forever. The echo chamber, repetitive conversations with a dwindling court. For a man who had once commanded nations and conversed with the great kings, queens, and thinkers of his age, your social world on Saint Helena had shrunk to a tiny, isolated, and claustrophobic circle. You were not entirely alone. A small, fiercely loyal retinue of French followers had chosen to share your exile. Men like the devoted Count de Las Cases, the ever-present General Montholon, and General Bertrand, with his family. They were the last, tattered remnant of your grand imperial court, a handful of subjects for a king without a kingdom. But this small bubble of human company, which should have been a source of comfort, would itself become another instrument of your slow, psychological decline. The first and most profound problem was the monotony. With no new events, no new people, and no new information from the outside world, your conversations were doomed to fall into a deep and repetitive rut. There were only two subjects to talk about: the glorious past and the miserable present. You would spend endless hours, both during the formal dictation of your memoirs and in the long, empty evenings, recounting the same stories of your great battles and political triumphs, over and over again. For your companions, it was a duty to listen, to nod, and to ask the same questions. But it was a conversation trapped in a loop, a constant reliving of a life that was now gone forever. When you were not talking about the past, you were all consumed by the present. The other great, recurring topic of conversation was the endless catalogue of petty grievances against your British captors. Hours would be spent complaining about the poor quality of the wine, the dampness that seeped into the walls of Longwood, and, above all, the 1,000 small, bureaucratic cruelties of the governor, Sir Hudson Lowe. This created a toxic, insular, and deeply unhealthy atmosphere. Your tiny court, cut off from the world, had become a psychological echo chamber, a place where the same resentments and frustrations were aired, repeated, and amplified day after day with no possibility of resolution. Under this immense pressure of isolation and boredom, your small community began to fracture. Petty jealousies and bitter rivalries, which would have been insignificant in a real court, became magnified in this small, pressurized environment. Your followers would scheme against each other for your favor, for the honor of taking down your dictation, or for a seat closer to you at the dinner table. Eventually, the court began to shrink. The Count de Las Cases, one of your most devoted companions, was expelled from the island by Governor Lowe for trying to smuggle out secret letters. Others would eventually leave due to illness or despair. Your small world, already a prison, grew smaller still. The human company that should have been your salvation from the loneliness of your exile instead became another reflection of it. A closed loop of the same few faces, the same few stories, and the same few inescapable miserias. The war of words, the slow, tedious dictation of the memoirs. With your physical world shrunk to a few damp rooms and a windswept garden, and your social world reduced to an echo chamber of past glories and present miseries, you would have turned your still formidable energy to the only battlefield you had left, the battlefield of history itself. If you could no longer command armies, you would command the narrative. If you could no longer conquer nations, you would conquer your own legacy. The central, driving, and deeply tedious occupation of your life on Saint Helena was the slow, methodical, and relentless dictation of your memoirs. This was your final war, a campaign fought not with cannons, but with memory, words, and the sheer force of your will. The process was a daily, grinding ritual. You would spend hours in your study, a room filled with the books and maps that were the ghosts of your former life. You would pace back and forth like a caged lion for 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours a day, pouring out a torrent of words. Your loyal companions, men like the Count de Las Cases, would sit at a small desk, their hands cramping as they tried to capture the flood of your recollections in shorthand. You would dictate in a rapid, often chaotic stream of consciousness, reliving your greatest victories, justifying your most controversial decisions, and settling old scores with your long-dead rivals. This was not a gentle process of quiet reflection. It was a grueling intellectual labor for everyone involved. After the marathon dictation sessions, your exhausted secretaries would spend even more hours transcribing their messy, ink-blotched notes into a clean, legible copy. This copy would then be presented back to you for review. You would read it with a ruthlessly critical eye, making endless corrections, additions, and deletions, often deciding to rewrite entire sections. The revised text would then be handed back to the secretary, who would have to produce yet another clean copy for your final approval. It was a slow, circular, and often deeply frustrating process, a war of attrition fought against memory, language, and the profound, soul-crushing boredom of the task itself. Through this slow and tedious process, you were not merely recording history, you were actively creating it. The memoirs you dictated were a masterful work of propaganda, a carefully constructed monument to your own genius. You would gloss over your defeats, magnify your victories, and present your own actions in the most favorable possible light. This was your last and most enduring campaign. The physical empire you had built had crumbled to dust, but this new, verbal empire, you believed, could last forever. The slow, repetitive, and deeply boring work of dictation was the price you were willing to pay to ensure that the world would remember you not as a prisoner who died in a damp farmhouse at the end of the world, but as the Emperor Napoleon, the man who had mastered Europe and who was now, in his final act, mastering history itself. The first signs. A clinical examination of the early medical symptoms, the slow, grinding monotony of your daily routine, was soon joined by a new and more insidious companion, a quiet internal rebellion of your own body. At first, the signs were subtle, easy to dismiss, the kinds of minor ailments that might afflict any middle-aged man living in a damp and unhealthy climate. But these were not the random complaints of a body simply aging. They were the first, faint whispers of the malignancy that was slowly, silently, and inexorably consuming you from within. The final battle of your life was not to be fought on the fields of Europe, but in the quiet, microscopic landscape of your own cells. It began as a dull, persistent ache in your right side, a gnawing pain that you would at first attribute to the dampness of Longwood or an old campaign injury. You would complain of a general feeling of malaise, of a deep and profound fatigue that went beyond the simple boredom of your existence. Your once legendary energy, the vitality that had allowed you to work for 20 hours a day and wear out a dozen secretaries, began to desert you. You would find yourself needing to rest more often, your afternoon carriage rides becoming shorter, your pacing in the study less energetic. Then came the more specific and worrying symptoms, centered around your digestion. Your once formidable appetite began to wane. The repetitive, bland food that was a source of psychological torment now became a source of physical distress. You would complain of a constant feeling of nausea, of heartburn, and of a painful, prolonged indigestion that no amount of simple remedies could soothe. These early symptoms were documented by your physicians, but their understanding of what was happening inside your body was tragically limited by the primitive state of early 19th century medicine. They had no stethoscopes, no X-rays, no ability to see inside the living body. Their diagnoses were based on external observation and on the ancient and often incorrect theories of bodily humors. And so, your illness was given a host of vague and unhelpful names. It was hepatitis, a chronic inflammation of the liver, they said, brought on by the tropical climate. It was a gastric disturbance caused by stress and the poor quality of the food. It was hypochondria, the physical manifestation of your psychological despair, your body simply giving up in sympathy with your imprisoned spirit. These diagnoses, while perhaps containing a grain of truth about the contributing factors, completely missed the central, fatal reality. They were fumbling in the dark, treating the smoke while a great fire was beginning to rage, unseen, in the very core of your being. This was the beginning of the long, slow, and deeply tedious process of dying, a process that would be as monotonous and as repetitive as the daily routine of your island prison. The doctor's ledger, an analysis of repetitive and contradictory medical logs. As your physical world continued to shrink, another, more intimate, and far more terrifying battlefield began to open up, the battlefield of your own body, and the daily communiques from this internal war, the official records of your slow, inexorable decline, were kept in the pages of your doctor's ledgers. To delve into these medical logs is to enter a world of profound medical confusion, of professional rivalries, and of a science that was fumbling in the dark. The story they tell is not one of healing, but of a slow, tedious, and often contradictory documentation of a great man's decay, a day-by-day account of a mystery that the doctors themselves were utterly powerless to solve. Your primary physician for much of your exile was the Irish naval surgeon, Barry O'Meara. His daily entries in his journal would have followed a monotonous and repetitive pattern. General Bonaparte complained again of a dull pain in his right side. The general's pulse is weak. The general suffers from headaches and a general lassitude. O'Meara was sympathetic to you, and he genuinely believed that your ailments were caused, or at least greatly exacerbated, by the damp, unhealthy climate of Longwood and the constant, petty harassment of Governor Lowe. His prescription, repeated endlessly in his logs and his official reports, was always the same. You needed more exercise, better food, and, above all, a change of residence to a drier, more sheltered part of the island. His medical advice was, in effect, a form of political protest, a constant critique of the conditions of your imprisonment. This, of course, put him in direct and constant conflict with the governor, who saw O'Meara's diagnoses as a form of sedition, an attempt to build a medical case for your removal from the island. Eventually, O'Meara was dismissed by Lowe, and a new doctor, a Corsican physician named Francesco Antomarchi, was sent from Europe to take his place. Antomarchi's logs tell a different, but equally frustrating, story. He was a man trained in anatomy, but with little practical experience as a physician. He often disagreed with O'Meara's diagnoses, at first dismissing the liver complaint as a minor issue and attributing your growing fatigue to a lack of exercise. His prescribed treatments were often more aggressive, involving painful procedures like the application of blisters, caustic plasters, designed to draw out the bad humors from the body. His logs are a testament to the primitive and often brutal nature of 19th century medicine, a series of painful, ineffective treatments that did nothing to halt the progress of your underlying disease. The true rabbit hole of these medical logs, however, lies in their contradictions and their omissions. The doctor's entries were not just private medical records, they were political documents, constantly being scrutinized by Governor Lowe. Their descriptions of your symptoms would often change depending on the political pressures of the day. A period of good health might be exaggerated to prove that the conditions at Longwood were not so bad after all, while a period of sickness would be downplayed to avoid giving you any leverage in your constant battle with the governor. To read these ledgers is to realize that you were trapped not just by a physical illness, but by a medical narrative that was being actively manipulated by all sides. The tedious, repetitive, and often contradictory entries in these doctors' journals are the perfect record of your final years. A slow, inexorable physical decline, documented by a primitive science that could neither understand nor cure it, and interpreted through a political lens that cared less about your health than about the control of your story. The arsenic theory, a slow analysis of poison and hair samples. For over a century after your death, the official story of your decline was the one written by your doctors. A sad, slow, and unremarkable surrender to a catalogue of mundane ailments, a stomach ulcer, perhaps, or a chronic liver complaint, all fatally exacerbated by the miserable conditions of your island prison. It was a story of medical failure and environmental decay. But in the middle of the 20th century, a new and far more sensational theory began to emerge. A theory that sought to transform your slow, tedious decline into something far more dramatic. A cold-blooded, systematic, and perfectly executed murder. This theory was born not from a dusty historical chronicle, but from the strange, almost magical ability of modern science to listen to the whispers of the dead. The rabbit hole begins with the strange 19th century custom of keeping locks of hair from the deceased as mementos. Throughout your exile, you had often given small locks of your fine, silky hair to your loyal followers, to visiting admirers, and even to your captors. These small, intimate relics were preserved across the world, treasured by families for generations. In the 1960s, a Swedish dentist and amateur toxicologist named Sten Forscherfood became obsessed with your case. He read your physician's memoirs and the detailed accounts of your symptoms, and he saw a pattern that the 19th century doctors, with their limited knowledge, could not. The chronic, gnawing stomach pain, the debilitating fatigue, the nausea, the hair loss. To Forscherfood, this was not the signature of a simple ulcer. It was the classic, textbook symptomology of chronic, slow-acting, arsenic poisoning. To test his theory, he managed to obtain several of these authenticated locks of your hair. He then subjected them to a then new and revolutionary scientific process known as neutron activation analysis. This is an incredibly sensitive technique, capable of detecting microscopic, trace elements in a sample with a precision that was previously unimaginable. The process is a form of nuclear alchemy. The hair samples were bombarded with neutrons inside a nuclear reactor, which transformed the atoms of any arsenic present into a radioactive isotope. As this isotope decayed, it emitted a unique gamma-ray signature, a specific energy signal that the scientists could measure. The amount of radiation detected was directly proportional to the amount of arsenic present in the hair. The results were shocking. The analysis revealed that your hair contained levels of arsenic that were not just elevated, but were between 13 and 40 times the normal, natural amount. The science seemed irrefutable, but it was the timeline revealed by the hair that was most compelling. Because hair grows at a relatively constant rate, a long strand of it acts as a kind of biological timeline, a living record of what was in a person's bloodstream. By analyzing different sections of the same hair, scientists could see that the arsenic had been administered not in a single massive dose, but in a series of smaller, intermittent doses over a long period of time. This was not an accident. It was a methodical, patient, and carefully managed poisoning, designed to mimic the symptoms of a slow, natural illness. The theory of a secret, political assassination, once a fringe conspiracy, now had the hard, cold backing of nuclear science. But as with all things in your story, the final truth remained tantalizingly, maddeningly, out of reach. The true malignancy, a tedious medical breakdown of stomach cancer, the story of a secret, slow-acting poison, is a compelling one. It offers a narrative of intrigue, of conspiracy, of a great man brought down by the hidden hand of his enemies. It is a story that transforms a slow, undignified decline into a final, dramatic act of political theatre. But there is another theory, one that is far less romantic, far less conspiratorial, but perhaps, in its own way, even more terrifying. This theory requires no secret assassins or hidden vials of poison. It suggests that the true enemy was not an outside force, but an internal one, a rebellion within the emperor's own body. This is the official, historical, and deeply tedious medical explanation for your death, stomach cancer. To the modern mind, a diagnosis of cancer is a clinical and scientific reality. But in the early 19th century, it was a word spoken in hushed tones, a terrifying and mysterious sentence of death. It was a disease that was poorly understood, often referred to simply as the ulcer or the malignancy, a process that seemed to involve the body literally consuming itself from the inside out. And the symptoms that you displayed in your final years on Saint Helena, when viewed through a modern medical lens, create a textbook case history for the slow, agonizing progression of advanced gastric cancer. The chronic, gnawing pain in your right side, the debilitating fatigue, the constant nausea, These were the early signs. But as the disease progressed, the symptoms would have become more specific and more horrific. You would have experienced a profound loss of appetite, or anorexia, finding it almost impossible to eat. This would have led to a dramatic and visible wasting of your body, a condition known as cachexia, where the cancer actively hijacks the body's metabolism, causing a rapid loss of muscle and fat. You, who had once been described as stout and robust, would have become a gaunt, skeletal figure, your old uniforms hanging loosely on your withered frame. The most telling symptom, and the one that points most directly to the true nature of your illness, was the color of your vomit. In your final months, you began to suffer from episodes of vomiting, a dark, blackish, brown substance. Your doctors at the time were baffled by this, but a modern physician would recognize it instantly. This was what is known as coffee ground vomit, the telltale sign of a slow, internal bleed in the upper gastrointestinal tract, where the blood has been partially digested by the stomach's acid. This was the signature of a large, ulcerating tumor that was slowly eating its way through the wall of your stomach. It was a sign that the disease was in its final, aggressive, and unstoppable phase. This theory does not require us to believe in a secret poisoner, only in the cruel, random, and impersonal malignancy of a disease that was, and still is, a terrifyingly efficient killer. The long decline, a day-by-day chronicle of a body failing. The diagnosis, whether it was arsenic poisoning or stomach cancer, was in many ways irrelevant to the daily reality of your existence. Both were a death sentence. And so, the final year of your life, from the middle of 1820 to the spring of 1821, became a slow, agonizing, and deeply tedious chronicle of a great body failing. This was not a dramatic, sudden collapse, but a slow, grinding war of attrition, a day-by-day retreat in the face of an enemy that could not be outmaneuvered or defeated. The logs kept by your companions and physicians during this period are a monotonous and heartbreaking record of this final, unwinnable campaign. The days would begin with a profound and unconquerable fatigue. The simple act of getting out of bed would become a monumental effort. Your valets would find you weak, your skin pale and clammy, your pulse thready and faint. The long, formal process of the morning toilette, once a ritual of imperial defiance, would become a draining ordeal. The hot baths, once a source of comfort, would now often leave you feeling exhausted and faint. Your once formidable energy, the force of nature that had driven you across the battlefields of Europe, was now entirely consumed by the quiet, internal battle being waged within your own cells. Your world, already a prison, would shrink even further. The short carriage rides would cease entirely. The slow, shuffling walks in the damp and windswept garden would become less and less frequent, until finally, you were almost entirely confined to the gloomy, oppressive interior of Longwood House. You would spend most of your days lying on a sofa in the drawing room, wrapped in a dressing gown, a silent, gaunt figure surrounded by the ghosts of your former life, the maps of your great victories, the books you could no longer summon the energy to read. Your diet, already a source of misery, would become a form of torture. The gnawing pain in your stomach was now a constant companion, sometimes a dull ache, sometimes a sharp, stabbing agony. You would be plagued by relentless nausea and frequent violent episodes of vomiting. This made eating almost impossible. Your companions would watch in despair as you pushed away the food that your chef so carefully prepared, your body no longer able to accept the very sustenance it so desperately needed. Your once stout frame would wither away, the visible, external sign of the internal devastation. And with this physical wasting came a deep and profound cold. You would complain of being constantly chilled to the bone, huddling by the fire even on the mildest of days, your body's internal furnace no longer able to generate its own heat. The slow, tedious, and repetitive entries in the daily logs tell the entire story. The Emperor is very weak today. The Emperor was sick again this morning. The Emperor complains of the cold. It is the simple, boring, and deeply human language of a body that is slowly, methodically, and inexorably shutting down. The final entries, mundane last activities, and final conversations. As the spring of 1821 arrived, it was clear to everyone at Longwood, even the ever-skeptical Governor Lowe, that the end was near. The final month of your life was a slow, quiet, and deeply mundane descent into the final abyss. The grand, defiant project of dictating your memoirs, the war of words that had consumed so much of your energy, had finally ceased. Your strength was gone. The daily logs kept by your last loyal companions, General Montholon and General Bertrand, now chronicled a world that had shrunk to the size of a single room, and a life that was measured not in campaigns or political victories, but in spoonfuls of broth and hours of fitful, pain-filled sleep. In your rare moments of lucidity, your mind, the mind that had once held the complex map of an entire continent in its grasp, was now occupied with the small, final, and deeply human task of putting your affairs in order. You would summon your companions to your bedside, and, in a voice that was often barely a whisper, you would dictate your last will and testament. This was not a single grand document, but a long, complex, and repetitive series of codicils and additions, as you meticulously listed the bequests you wished to make to your family, to the soldiers who had served you, and to the loyal followers who had shared your final miserable exile. It was the last, administrative act of a man who had once administered an empire, a final, obsessive attempt to impose order on a world that was now dissolving around you. Your conversations, once filled with grand pronouncements on strategy and history, now turned to these small, final matters. You would worry about the financial security of your companions after your death, and you would give them precise, almost tedious, instructions on how to preserve your legacy. You ordered that your heart should be removed from your body and placed in a silver vase to be sent to your wife, Marie-Louise. You gave detailed instructions on how your meager personal effects, your campaign furniture, your snuff boxes, your books should be divided amongst your son and your family. And in these final days, your mind would often drift back. You would speak, in a rambling and sometimes incoherent way, of your first wife, Josephine, the great love of your life. And you would speak of your son, the King of Rome, the boy you had not seen since he was an infant. But these were not grand, theatrical deathbed speeches. They were the quiet, fragmented, and often mundane ramblings of a dying man. The final entries in the Longwood logs tell a story not of an emperor meeting his end, but of a human being succumbing to a terrible illness. A story of pain, of weakness, of brief moments of clarity in a sea of delirium. It was a slow, quiet, and deeply personal surrender. The autopsy. A slow, clinical examination of the emperor's remains. Your long, slow, and agonizing battle was finally over. The emperor was dead. But for the small, isolated community on Saint Helena, and for the world that was waiting for the news, one final, grim, and deeply controversial act remained. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, insistent on proving to the world that his prisoner had not been mistreated and that there had been no foul play, ordered an immediate and thorough autopsy. On the afternoon of May 6, 1821, the day after your death, the billiard room at Longwood House, the room where you had once spread your campaign maps, was transformed into a makeshift operating theatre. It was here that the final, clinical, and deeply tedious process of examining your mortal remains would take place, a final invasion of your physical self that would create a medical mystery as enduring as the legend of your life. The scene was a tense and crowded one. A team of 7 British surgeons, led by Dr. Archibald Arnott, gathered around the table where your body lay. They were observed by a group of your loyal French companions, including General Montholon and General Bertrand, who stood as silent, hostile witnesses, determined to ensure that their emperor's body was treated with respect. Also present was your own physician, Dr. Antomaki, whose own medical reputation was now on the line. The air was thick with the oppressive heat of the day and the palpable tension between the two national factions. The autopsy began, a slow, methodical, and gruesome procedure conducted by the flickering light of candles. The surgeon's report, when it was finally written, was a document of dry, clinical, and seemingly irrefutable facts. They noted the extreme wasting of your body, the almost complete absence of body fat, but the central discovery was inside. Upon opening your abdominal cavity, they found the cause of death. Your stomach was the site of a massive, ulcerating, cancerous growth, which had perforated the stomach wall, creating a small hole through which the contents had begun to leak. They also found that your liver was enlarged and congested. To the British surgeons, the case was closed. Napoleon Bonaparte had died of a severe and long-standing stomach cancer, a disease which had also killed your father. The official cause of death was recorded. The report was signed, and the matter was, for them, settled. But for your French companions, and for your own doctor, Antomarchi, the conclusion was not so simple. They had witnessed the same autopsy, but they had seen it through a different lens, one of deep suspicion, and a refusal to accept a mundane, natural end for their great emperor. Antomarchi would later write his own, competing account of the autopsy, in which he downplayed the significance of the stomach ulcer and instead emphasized the diseased state of your liver. This was a crucial distinction. A diseased liver, he argued, was consistent with the damp, unhealthy climate of Saint Helena and the constant, petty harassment of Governor Lowe. His conclusion implied that you had died not from a random, unlucky disease, but that you had been killed, slowly and deliberately, by the miserable conditions of your imprisonment. And so, from the very moment your body was closed, two competing medical narratives were born: the British story of cancer and the French story of a climate-induced liver disease. This fundamental disagreement, this battle over the interpretation of your own internal organs, was the seed from which a century of conspiracy theories, including the arsenic plot, would eventually grow. Your body was no longer your own. It had become a battlefield of medical and political opinion, the last breath, the final, anticlimactic moments. The autopsy was complete, the competing medical narratives were born, and all that remained was the final, quiet act of putting the emperor's body to rest. But even in these last solemn moments, the story of your death was defined by a profound and almost surreal sense of anticlimax. For a man whose life had been a constant spectacle of grand, historic moments of glorious coronations, of dramatic battlefield victories, of world-altering political summits, your death was a remarkably small and private affair, a quiet, almost pathetic, fading out in a damp room at the end of the world. In your final, delirious hours, your mind, which had once dictated the fate of nations, became a landscape of fragmented memories and confused whispers. Your last recorded words, according to your loyal companion, General Montholon, were a jumble of French tête d'armée, head of the army, a final, ghostly echo of the life of command that had defined you. As the end approached, a violent storm, a tropical tempest, descended upon the island of Saint Helena. The relentless wind howled around the flimsy walls of Longwood House, and a cold, driving rain lashed against the windows. It was as if the very elements were providing the dramatic, Wagnerian backdrop for the death of a great man, that the quiet, squalid reality of the scene itself refused to provide. You died at 5:49 in the evening on May 5, 1821. Your death was not a heroic last stand, but a quiet surrender. The men who were with you, your last tiny court of loyal exiles, performed the final sad rituals. They dressed your body not in a simple shroud, but in the iconic uniform that had become your symbol, the green coat of the chasseurs, à cheval of the Imperial Guard. They laid you in state on your small, iron campaign bed, the same one you had used on the battlefields of Austerlitz and Wagram. But there was to be no grand state funeral, no procession through the streets of Paris. Your jailer, Sir Hudson Lowe, decreed that you were to be buried on the island. A spot was chosen in a quiet, secluded valley, a place where you had sometimes enjoyed walking, near a spring whose fresh water you had preferred. Your final tomb was a simple, nameless one. Governor Lowe, in a final act of petty, bureaucratic pedantry, refused to allow the inscription Napoleon on your tombstone, as it would imply a royal status the British government did not recognize. Your French companions, in turn, refused to allow the name Napoleon Bonaparte, as they felt it was an insult to your imperial dignity. And so, a compromise of silence was reached. You were buried in an unmarked grave, under a simple stone slab, identified only by the weeping willows that shaded the spot. The greatest and most famous man of the 19th century was laid to rest in a tomb with no name, a final, poignant testament to the profound and total nature of your defeat. An epic life ends in a whisper. And so, the greatest and most turbulent life of the 19th century comes to a close, not with the thunder of cannon or the roar of an adoring crowd, but with the quiet, final exhalation of a sick man in a damp room, 1,300 miles from anywhere that mattered. The final chapter of Napoleon's story is a profound and unsettling one, a slow, 6-year-long epilogue that seems almost designed to be an anticlimax, a deliberate and methodical dismantling of a myth. His enemies had finally understood that to truly defeat him, it was not enough to capture his body. They had to conquer his spirit, to crush his legend under the immense, grinding weight of sheer, soul-destroying boredom. We have followed his journey into this profound stillness. We endured the 70-day voyage into oblivion, a floating prison that stripped him of his titles and his freedom. We have walked the bleak volcanic landscape of his island cage, a prison whose greatest security feature was its own profound, soul-crushing isolation. We have lived within the damp, rat-infested walls of Longwood House, a residence that was not a home, but a carefully chosen instrument of his physical and psychological decay. We have felt the constant, humiliating pressure of the jailer's gaze, a system of surveillance so total it turned his every waking moment into a performance for his captors. We have sat through the long, monotonous days, governed by the rigid, repetitive routine that was his last, defiant act of imposing order on a world he could no longer control. We have tasted the bland, mediocre food from the imperial menu, a daily reminder of his complete dependence on the nation that had defeated him. We have listened in on the circular, repetitive conversations of his dwindling court, an echo chamber of past glories and present miseries, and we have witnessed the slow, agonizing, and deeply tedious war of words, the dictation of his memoirs, his final desperate battle to control his own legacy. And then, we watched as the final, internal enemy laid its siege. We saw the first, subtle signs of his illness, the gnawing pain, and the profound fatigue. We have sifted through the contradictory and politically charged ledgers of his doctors, men who were fumbling in the dark to diagnose a disease they could not comprehend. We have explored the tantalizing scientific mystery of the arsenic in his hair, a theory that promises a dramatic, conspiratorial end. And we have confronted the far more likely and far more mundane reality of a slow, wasting death from stomach cancer, a final, impersonal enemy against which his military genius was utterly powerless. Ultimately, to survive his final days on Saint Helena would have required a different kind of strength than the one he possessed. It required not the strength to conquer, but the strength to endure. It required a resilience not against enemy armies, but against the slow, creeping, and invisible enemies of hopelessness, of boredom, of isolation, and of the slow, internal betrayal of one's own body. The story of his exile is a profound and deeply human tragedy. It is the story of a giant, a force of nature, being brought low not by a great battle, but by 1,000 small, tedious, and deeply boring cuts. His epic life ended in a whisper, a final, quiet surrender in a forgotten corner of the world.